I'm pleased to welcome Nadia Urbinati, Kyriakos Sakopoulos Professor of Political Theory and Hellenic Studies at Columbia University. Her forthcoming book, Democracy Disfigured, Opinion, Truth and the People, is due to be published by Harvard University Press later this year. Professor Urbinati, could you please explain briefly what your new book is about and why you decided to write it?
Thank you. So, this book is about the figure of democracy, which I compare to figure we see in people, friends, and suddenly sometimes we have problems recognizing them because they had an accident or in these moments of celebrity time, a surgery for beauty or aesthetical reason, and sometimes they are disfigured instead. So my idea is that democracy has a figure, and the figure that makes us recognize it whenever we compare it with other regimes. For instance, we see it immediately as a democracy when we contrast it with a tyrannical regime. So, what are the characteristics of this figure that make us recognize it immediately? And so I go through these characteristics without entering into the substance, that is the body analogy, which is not my topic, but the external manifestation of the figure. And the external manifestation of the figure is the fact that all individuals, citizens in this case, are included and they have a voice, each of them one vote, equally variable or with the same weight, and their votes are counted by majority rule, which is a recognition of transitory validity of each decision and thus the open room to the revision of any decision made by a democratic community. And then also the fact that the figure of democracy is divided by two, is made by two legs. The one of decision-making procedures, that is sovereignty in the classical sense, the will of the sovereign, and the other one is a specific leg of democracy, which is opinion, system formation, and what we call public opinion. So, of course, public opinion doesn't have the power of making laws, and we don't want this, but it has the power of influencing, preparing for, changing the habit, mentality, and opinion that then gets translated into the law. So these two are important, they need to be separated and distinct, but also in correlation, in contact, and the disfigurement, in my view, today operates in this leg, in the leg of opinion, because there is no way of saying that we are risking losing suffrage. We cannot say so. But certainly we don't have, or we risk to lose, the equal chance to make our voice in the making of opinion not strong enough to be heard. And I think that on the side of the opinion, we should pay attention to the disfigurement today. So, and do you want I go on describing the disfigurements? Quickly?
Yeah, we'll return to it in a bit if that's okay.
Good.
Thank you. So you've just mentioned the diarchy of will and opinion. That's to say, you've argued in the book that will and opinion are the two necessarily separate forms of power that constitute democratic sovereignty. I was wondering if you could tell us where this idea comes from historically.
Well, this is an interesting question because I always work with, starting with the book on Mill and with the idea that democracy, particularly in the representative system we know about and we live in today, is different from direct democracy, not simply because we are not there in the assembly raising our hands and making our decisions directly, but also because there is an indirect way of behaving and acting in the public through media, newspapers, collecting of information. This is a large body of public activity we do that is crucial for preparing decisions, although it is not inside of the domain of institutional rules and regulations. Rightly so, because it pertains to the domain of freedom, individual freedom of association, free press. And so then I went down to what I see as the origin of modern representative government or democracy, well, the English Revolution. And then you realize that, and the work by Skinner was very important for me in this case, that these Republicans, so-called Republicans of the 17th century, like Milton and Sidney, they all of them, they were in favor of elected government and thus representative institutions. And the first thing they claimed for was the free press, freedom of religion, freedom of manifestation of ideas. And this, since that, became an important component of this government. So it's a government made by two heads and two leading power, although one doesn't want to have the final say, but it wants to have all the time the open possibility for criticizing, surveilling, monitoring, pressing, pushing, even overturning and rebelling if needed. This was Locke. So that is the origin of, personally, of my trajectory toward the idea of diarchy.
Thank you. So is this where the normativity of your argument comes from, that the normative value of democracy lies in its procedures? I was wondering if you could say something about that, what it means and how it affects our perception of the outcomes of democratic decision-making, or indeed whether we should be thinking in terms of outcomes at all.
Thank you. Yes. Well, why procedure? Because if we see the externality, as I said, the shape of democracy is made by its rules and its procedures. The way in which people collect their own wills, count them, and make decisions is what characterizes democracy, wherever you go. No matter the substance of this specific law, the other specific habits of behavior in the public, but there are some basic procedures and rules that belong to democracy by itself since the time of Clisthenes and Pericles and Ephialtes. So this is the tradition, and this remained identical to itself through time, even if we used to vote for candidates instead of voting on laws. So this is the procedure, and the procedure, unfortunately, has been vilified, trashed down, because it was identified for so many years with Schumpeterianism in its rudest sense, meaning democracy is simply going to election to select an elite and then go home and do your job as usual. Participation has no place here because, of course, since it is all this informal opinion formation that you cannot check, you cannot count, you cannot prove, this cannot be considered to be as part of the procedure. This was the classical. Of course, Schumpeter had his own reasons to do so or to say so, because he had to react against the totalitarian, total content-based democracy. Now, after several decades in Western democracies of stabilization of democracy, we realize that these minimalist or disparaging view of proceduralism is bad for democracy, because we don't see that it's precisely that procedural organization of public life that makes for democracy and requires the diarchic powers. So we have to recover proceduralism from that old, not very sympathetic to democracy position, a la Schumpeter, and to see it as the flesh and the bone of democracy, so that everybody should have an equal voice, and this is substance because it is procedure.
Thank you very much. So, following on from that, I was wondering if we could return to the language of disfigurement that you mentioned earlier. You use the language of disfigurement to critically analyse various anti-political and more specifically anti-democratic arguments within contemporary political theory.
Yeah.
If there are such disfigurements, as you've been describing, do you think that there ever has been a paradigmatic representative democracy? That's to say, a democracy that was not in any way disfigured.
Well, this is... well, it's impossible to say that it was never disfigured. The question is, according to me, when this disfigurement appears so evident and so disturbingly strong that we recognize it as such. Of course, democracy, representative democracy is not a static system that is always like that and will be always like that. As Bernard Manin told us, and I think he was is right, that there was a representative government with a system of notabilate in the 19th century without universal suffrage. Then there was a system based on mass democracy and universal suffrage with the political parties. Now we live in a time, and this is the time that interests me, of populist, of plebiscitarian or audience democracy. So we recognize these differences in relation to what? In relation to the idea that we have a representation as a system thanks to which citizens enjoy two powers when they go to vote. The power of creating a majority and the power of having a voice that is represented in the House. And these two powers we recognize when they don't go along together because we feel sometimes to have no voice enough, not to be represented enough. So when we see so, and this was the topic of my book on representative democracy, this is a perception we have. As Bob Dahl used to write in the 50s and the 60s, the perception the citizens have of how democracy works is crucial in the way in which democracy works. So this perception is relevant. And I think that we today realize, or we feel, and actually it's more than a feeling because we don't go to vote anymore when we realize that there is no payback for what we can do. And this is what we can say, well, there is something to be worried about. And this worried about is what I call disfigurement.
Thank you. As a follow-up question, I was wondering if you think, and if so how, disfigured democracies can be reconfigured in a politically legitimate way. This question was inspired by your conclusion in which you claim that the vision of democratic proceduralism that you set out is, in fact, very demanding both to the citizen and the state.
It is very demanding. It is like to keep maintenance in a house and to keep the house working. So it requires a work of monitoring and a work of interest in the good of our house called democracy. And so the disfigurements are three mainly that I recognize, but you can, the three are all of them related to the, as I said, of the lack of opinion, on the opinion side of the story. And so it can take the aspect of a technocratic or a mythology of competence, able to overcome opinion, trashing down opinion as neither right nor wrong, and thus a system of confusion and illusion and ideology to be replaced by the truth in the Platonic sense. There is this tendency in today's too, not only in the conservative tribe of political spectrum, but also in political theory with epistemic transformation of the liberative theory of democracy. The second one is a populistic one, when we the people becomes no longer the sovereign part of the common home of all of us together, but wants to enter in the institutions and make the rules for all, meaning it is the power of the strong majority imposing itself as the power of all, and thus conquering the institutions and it's very dangerous for minorities, the division of power, and also is an open door to corruption, to the privileges of those who are in. And then the other one is what I call the plebiscitarism of the audience. Audience democracy means to make the people to be transformed into the public, and the public is like the public of a theater, witnessing and standing and clapping or booing what the leaders do, like in the Roman Forum, but without having a participatory activity very prominent. They are simply receptive or passive or answering to the, and this is what today is very much strong, and thus, in my view, we coming to your question, what can we do? We should perhaps intervene in the domain of opinion formation, media and free press, transforming freedom of speech truly in a political right and not simply the right of the individual against the state.
Thank you. You make numerous references throughout the book to the regime of Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, to his technocratic successors, and to the effects of social and political inequality on the formation of political liberty. Given the normativity of your argument in favour of democratic procedures, I was wondering whether you could say something about the historical and political context in which your book was written.
Yeah, so the stimulus for thinking in terms of diarchy and the disfigurement of democracy developing from inside, from within the world of opinion formation, of course, came to me from my country. I used to write in newspapers there in Repubblica, and all these 5 years I monitored the transformation of the political language, of the notion and the sense of participation inside of that country, and the transformation truly of the procedural order because of the transformation of the opinion domain. So I think that we should pay attention to that very much. Moreover, in the United States also there is an interesting phenomenon of attention to free speech, whether it is a totally private or even also a political right. Think about the debate inside of the Supreme Court and within the community of jurists and constitutionalists and political theorists on private money in the system of opinion formation. So it's true that money is like voting. It's true that money needs to have the same representation as individuals. This is the topic today, which means that the real issue in which democracy risks an oligarchic degeneration is precisely the domain of judgment formation, of opinion formation. And thus we should claim, this is the argument made in America by Baker and more recently also Post, to make the argument of equality, which we have used until now in the distribution of the right to equal voice, voting, make the same argument in the domain of opinion. Of course, we cannot prove that if we participate in the opinion making, we have a better democracy. But this is not the point. For this reason, we need to be very proceduralist. Regardless of the outcome, it is good in itself, because this is what democracy is about. We don't claim the right to vote in order to produce who knows what. We claim the right to vote in order to be free. And thus, we claim the equal right to count and to have a voice in the public in the same very logic, and regardless of the outcome. And this is what interests me a lot in this time.
Thank you. The book seems to concentrate somewhat understandably on consolidated Western democracies. Could you say something perhaps about where your argument sits in relation to unconsolidated and developing democracies in the non-Western world?
Yes. You know, in our discipline, political theory, but above all comparative, the interest in the last decades was for democratization in non-democratic countries, transition theory from non-democratic to democratic, but there was no much interest in the need of democratization of democratic country. So we should concentrate in already democratic countries, not because we like them, but because they present us with new challenges and problems that we never thought about it before. So it is precisely the symbology or the analogy of the home or the house I made before. We made the house and then we start living inside of this house, but suddenly we realize that something doesn't work. So it's not building new homes, but fixing or fixing the home we have, maintenance of the home we have. So what is important in my view is that European democracies, more even the American democracy, but European democracy is even more in front of us as a critical moment of populism or anti-politics, plebiscitarian leaders, how this can be a real issue to take care of and to try to, at least to make people see it as a problem and then together to see whether it's possible to fix or not. This is another story that doesn't belong to our discipline, but certainly to bring this as a problem into the political theory community.
Thank you. And lastly, I just wanted to briefly return to the book you mentioned earlier, the 2002's Mill on Democracy, From the Athenian Polis to Representative Government.
Yes.
In that book, you discuss John Stuart Mill's emphasis on the roles played by agonistic speech and publicity in what you called the open competition for political recognition. Indeed, Mill placed much value on the discursive process of opinion formation as an expression of political liberty.
Yes.
To what extent does Mill make sense of and complement your own arguments in Democracy Disfigured?
That's a great question, because everything starts from there, actually. In my at least experience as a student. So Mill, not as a theorist of liberalism as we know, of course, individual liberty, but as a theorist who saw earlier on the specificity, risks, and beauty or negativity of democracy in modern time, even better than, in my view at least, as Tocqueville, because it didn't have this kind of resentment toward the society that was the old regime that was declining badly. He didn't have any kind of nostalgia for something was no longer there. He was ready to embrace the new. But he was also very cautious of the problems. And since he had such a great experience, knowledge of the ancient Athenian democracy, he was the first one to mix up these two traditions and to recognize that the tradition of democracy is one, even if one is direct and the other one is representative. And then he was also able to see the risks coming from the domain of opinion. How the regime of opinion can change individual mind and make us subdued to very good technicians of the opinion industry. And he tried to fix it or to solve the problem in his own way, which I don't agree with, by giving more power to the wise versus the others, by invoking the open ballot in order to control better the people. That is, the strategies of solution he developed were completely wrong, but they were wrong because Mill was scared about equality very much, about political equality. So he thought that he had to control equality in order to keep liberty safe. In my view, and this is one of the theoretical arguments of the proceduralist definition I give, means and ends must go together in democracy. You cannot fix it by trashing down or violating one of its principles, and the basic principle is equal political power, equal political liberty. So you cannot diminish equality. You have to keep together the two. And thus the solution he gave were perhaps contradictory in my view to democracy, but he saw the problem. And this is what made me very interested in these contradictory theorists.
Professor Urbinati, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.